Hello and welcome again. I am Dr. Joanne Lasowski, journalism educator and author, and we are back to discuss issues of importance to the South Caucasus. With me today is former U.S. Ambassador Carey Cavanaugh, now the director of the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce at the University of Kentucky. He has extensive experience with conflict resolution, and of course, he served as the co-chair of the OSCE Minsk group. Welcome, Mr. Ambassador.
It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Your experience with peace building in the region is extensive, and we are very grateful for your reflections on current situations. But I want to begin by asking you about a recent situation between Russia and Armenia. Armenian Prime Minister Pashinyan was reported to have said the Russian Iskander missiles used against targets in Azerbaijan were ineffective. He's backpedaling that a little bit, saying he was misinformed. Russia, of course, was incensed that Pashinyan would discount Russian military missiles. Is this a serious misstep for Pashinyan?
I don't think so. I think he faces more significant political problems over domestic concern about the developments that took place in the war with Azerbaijan. The question of Russian hardware, also, I would say the key issue here wasn't a Iskander missile. It was more questions about whether there was sufficient ability to overcome Azerbaijani air defense, anti-air defense systems that wiped out the air defense that the Karabakh forces had. Mainly it's this newer drone technology that Azerbaijan had acquired from both Israel and Turkey. And that proved to be something that the Russian military hardware in Armenia wasn't prepared for.
So as Pashinyan finds himself in a crisis there at home, there are new hints of war breaking out again as the weather thaws in the region as well. What are your thoughts on that possibility?
Well, that's always been one of my concerns, and I think it brings us to the central question here, and that's about peace and can peace be negotiated. President Aliyev had said repeatedly, and I disagree with this statement, that the diplomatic solutions were never there. He solved it. He solved it with military force. And in fact, I would argue it's not solved. This situation today, the situation after the fighting, is no more durable than the situation after the fighting back in the 1990s. What's absent here is a definitive peace settlement, and I think without one, you can never get beyond the risk of a re-eruption of hostilities. We've seen time and again here that this is not a incident that just arose and is done. This is a long-term situation in the region between the Armenian and the Azerbaijani people. I think it can be resolved. I think it can be negotiated, but you can't simply fight and solve it. So what we see today is another ceasefire. There was a ceasefire agreement almost 100 days ago to today, on November 9th, and it has some elements of a peace settlement in it. But there has been no peace settlement. And even in the ceasefire discussion, President Putin and President Macron of France and the US, all three of the co-chair countries, were very emphatic of the need to have the more standard negotiated peace. And President Putin had included that too in the provisions for the ceasefire, that those talks would continue, must continue.
So you mentioned President Aliyev, and in a recent press conference, he said he was wholly in favor of a more comprehensive peace accord for the region. What would you see as a more comprehensive peace accord?
Well, one of the key issues that is totally outstanding is the question of status for the people living in Karabakh. That has always been, in terms of the peace settlement, one of the thorniest questions. Azerbaijan had always been willing to say it would permit the highest degree of autonomy as possible within Azerbaijan. And the people living in Karabakh had been saying very vocally that they weren't comfortable with that. They were more in favor of either independence or a more permanent relationship with Armenia that ensured their being protected. And with 20, 30 years of discussions in the Minsk group, lots of different formulas were tossed out that might have achieved that end. Never a formula that was totally satisfactory to either side, although they did come close on occasion, but never one that both could embrace. I think you need to get back to that discussion and find a solution to that. That said, there are a number of things they also need to be addressing in the short term. There are some key outstanding issues that are problematic today that can be resolved much more quickly than a definitive peace settlement. First among those, I would say, is the issue of return of POWs, missing, accommodating for that, and the return of remains. This was in the November 9th agreement. The International Committee for the Red Cross was already lined up to assist with this. The assumption is this would be done in a matter of days. And here we are 100 days later, and this is still an outstanding issue. I think that needs to be addressed quickly. Another one of vital importance is access to the region. It's not a surprise as a new regime is established there with Russian peacekeepers that there are different issues arising over access, but it's also clear that there are restrictions being placed on access, primarily from Baku, that are impeding the introduction of humanitarian assistance to a greater level. Humanitarian workers, international NGOs, as you mentioned, I'm chair of International Alert, a London-based NGO. They and many, many others have worked in the South Caucasus for decades, but they don't have the ability to access Karabakh in a simple and straightforward way. Neither, for that matter, do UN specialized agencies. So I think making that access smoother and more effective is vital to make sure that help can be given, both personal help and financial help on both sides of the line of where the fighting took place.
So, Mr. Ambassador, you mentioned that the Minsk group designed and developed various solid peace policies during the 20 plus 30 years in negotiations, but they failed to be enacted. Why? Who failed to secure the peace in the region?
Different reasons at different times. And the normal approach diplomatically in those types of agreements, nothing's agreed until everything's agreed. So you would get very close to a settlement and there'd be another issue and another tweak. And the Minsk group co-chairs would work on those. And that's legitimate. And I think the one thing that emerged from that, though, was it's clear, and there's almost a cycle to it, but at different times, the leadership on both sides has been prepared for peace. They've come very close. There was a close period during the leadership of Haidar Aliyev and President Ter-Petrosyan in Armenia. They came very close when I was working with them in Key West on an accord. They actually came very close in a direct discussion between Haidar Aliyev and Robert Kocharyan, looking at elements of what would be needed to craft a peace. That was impeded somewhat by the assassinations in the Armenian parliament. And actually part of that dialogue shifted to what became under discussion at Key West. But there have been different times, no, they've come close. Some of these efforts have been fairly straightforward. Others have been quite bold. So they've come close on both of those too. So I think the potential is there. I think in their hearts, for the leadership on both sides, there's an understanding that you really need this to let the region develop and grow the way it should. But it's politically hard to do. I think they need support in that, and I think the Minsk group helps with that. And I think having Russia, France, and the United States in that formula has in the past proven to help quite a bit.
You talked about access to the region, and we know that as well. You mentioned that Baku is what's standing in the way in many cases, but we know that there are 50,000 Armenians that are populating the area, and it seems like the Azerbaijanis are having some serious difficulties in gaining access to that area as well. So what is keeping the people out of that area?
Well, we're back again to the basic questions of why there was a conflict here and why this problem persists. It's a lack of confidence and trust by ethnic groups on each side of the other. And given the situation we just saw with the fighting, that's no surprise. It is very difficult to be engaged in a very hot war, have it come to a ceasefire, and immediately expect the other side, oh, they'll be comfortable, we won't be mistreated, we'll be fine. And in fact, the persistence of this problem with POWs that I mentioned, I think only serves to underscore that. If you can't get the POWs back, and there was agreement to do that, and international support to make that happen, then what confidence do you have in other things that are being stated? You need to build public trust. And right now we look on both sides, there's a public that's somewhat traumatized.
Do you have any idea why the return of many of the Azerbaijanis, why is that being delayed?
I do not know. I think the basic position I have is on all sides, everybody needs to be returned, remains need to be returned, missing need to be accounted for, prisoners of war need to be exchanged. It's not as easy that you can do it in an hour, but it certainly doesn't take 100 days. And I think, there's been some raising on the side I know of Azerbaijan. Well, they weren't soldiers. They were captured after the day of the ceasefire. But as we know, this was a very fluid situation right up to the point of the ceasefire. There should be a recognition that this just needs to be resolved and done with. And I think it can be. And I do know, having worked in the past with the Red Cross, they're an excellent intermediary in these kind of efforts. They bring, as we talked about earlier before the program, they bring a skill and expertise that's been developed across the world at handling precisely this kind of issue, so that they have the ability to make this happen quickly.
What does the Minsk group need to do to re-energize its peacemaking in the region?
Well, it's in part on the Minsk group, but it's in part on the leadership in both states. So what the Minsk group does, it is assists the leadership in Armenia and Azerbaijan. It works with them and with local people on the ground to find a formula that might work. But in the end, acceptance of that formula goes back to the parties. And the challenge there then is you need an engaged Minsk group and engaged parties. Right now, I think there's political difficulties in Armenia. I'm not sure the situation is right at all for a intensification, a really strong hard push right now toward a solution. I think to get back to starting a discussion of what elements need to be dealt with first and how might they be dealt with given the current reality. I think that discussion is very important. And I think a full-on collaboration, again, among the three co-chairs as to what approach they think could be most fruitful is important. The United States, as you know, we just had a change in our leadership. President Biden became president in January. President Trump left. He is still getting his cabinet through our Senate, and after that, he'll turn to other levels of appointments. Included in those will be for certain a new ambassador for OSCE itself. I think that's important, and I think there's a good chance with the Swedish chairmanship this year that more work could be done in Vienna toward that end, and all parties are represented there too. I don't know what the status will be on whether we retain our current co-chair or if we get a new one there too under the Biden administration. But those personnel things need to take place. I think once we see a new ambassador for the U.S. At OSCE, they're again back to experience. OSCE is an institution, has dealt with a number of conflicts in Europe. This is the first one it started on. It in fact, a bit naively at the time, back in the mid-1990s, thought this would be resolved quickly. Minsk had volunteered a venue to have a big conference, and there was some sense of, we'll all just go to Minsk and work this out. It became quickly apparent that wasn't how it worked. But in the intervening years, dealing with conflict in other areas, including Moldova and Georgia and Ukraine, I think OSCE now has a much greater appreciation of what can be done and how it can be done. And I think that venue and those instruments can be used well to help promote the process. I'd add OSCE by its nature is a consensus organization. It's how it was structured. All countries that are members have the ability to agree or not agree to policies. So that means there is not only the Minsk Group co-chairs represented there, but every other player in Europe, and including Russia, including Armenia and Azerbaijan. So there's an ability to have a more public discussion there, and maybe a valuable, less visible discussion there among diplomatic representatives on how could we move this forward. I hope to see that happen, as well as active engagement by the co-chairs.
So the Minsk group objectives were specific with regard to peacekeepers. So I want to talk a little bit about the Russian sort of hand in what's happening. Peacekeepers were not to be from any co-chair countries or neighboring countries, but now we have Russian peacekeepers in the region. Why do you imagine that there was a change of heart with regard to one of the co-chairs actually putting peacekeepers in the region?
I don't know that it was a change of heart. So one, that's not an ironclad rule. It was a concept and proposal that I had a hand in. This was basically put forth in the lead up to Key West, that this was seen as possibly the best solution. It was embraced by the other co-chairs. That, as you said, no neighbors, no co-chair countries, so no Russia, France, United States, no Georgia, no Turkey, no Iran. But the assumption was we would recruit either monitors, which was one possibility. You might not need peacekeepers, or peacekeepers if they were needed from other member countries of OSCE, and there are many. That was embraced at the time also by the parties of conflict. They were comfortable with that, and that sort of set on the table as discussions continued. How might we find a solution and a broader peace agreement. What we saw happen last year is an intensity of fighting that was disturbing to all parties. There was a rapid effort to reestablish a ceasefire, as there always has been in this conflict. And Moscow took the lead on that, which has also always been the case. And initially that did not work. France then played a greater role in that. That also did not work. The foreign ministers came to Washington, D.C. to meet with the American leadership, met with the Secretary of State and our National Security Advisor. That did not work. All three co-chairs had their representatives meet with the parties in Geneva. That did not work, and the fighting kept ratcheting up and becoming more significant. And it hit a point where I believe Moscow felt the only way to get a ceasefire was actually to put Russian boots on the ground. I don't think this was their original desire. I indeed feel they would have avoided this if they could. And I think the ceasefire agreement or settlement effort that came out of Moscow, and it's really a ceasefire. It's not a formal negotiated agreement, but it came out of discussions between Aliyev, Pashinyan, and President Putin. It drew on former elements that had been on the table. So everything aside from the peacekeepers being Russian alone, everything in that agreement had all been discussed in the past for decades by Minsk Group co-chairs. That peacekeeping element came because that was the only solution that Moscow could see could work. This wasn't a situation where France was going to send in peacekeepers. And again, that wasn't part of the original proposal. The United States was approaching a presidential transition. That clearly wasn't going to be the case. And again, we weren't nearby. And there was no peace agreement to go to Vienna with to approach the other OSCE member states and say, look, here's what we need. This type of person for this kind of duty for this period to make sure these elements take place. A withdrawal from territory, a transfer of land, a resettlement of regions. None of that was in place. All that was in place was a rapidly expanding war and a situation on the ground where the only outside group that had military forces in the region was, in fact, Russia, in Armenia already, at a base at Gyumri. Those forces, the peacekeepers, did not come from there, and that made sense. But I think to Russia, it recognized it too soon could be engulfed in this conflict because it did have a military presence on the ground. And how do you stop it and reestablish a ceasefire? At this point, it required the use of Russian peacekeepers.
Mr. Ambassador, isn't there some concern out there, however, that the boots on the ground, the Russian boots on the ground, are part of a larger strategy that Putin uses, for example, in Crimea and other areas? And I understand that they are handing out Russian passports to Armenians in the Karabakh region. Don't we see an underlying strategy that could have Russia in the area permanently?
I mean, Russian forces are already in the area. They already have been in Armenia for a long time. So I don't know that you could even say there's a change there. I don't think it's their strategy because I think there were genuine concerns about the expansion of this war becoming one that got out of hand. And I think that was clear. I think Russian desire is not to be there in this way. If you look at the Karabakh conflict and you look at ceasefires, and we've had a number of ceasefires since back into the mid-1990s, they've largely held, but they've held in a unique South Caucasus way. There were ceasefire violations all the time. Small arms fire, artillery fire, all the time. Periodic death along the line of contact, all the time. Every death is horrible. There were deaths there all the time. This is not an area where people look at as a standard introduction of peacekeeping forces. It's a settlement is approaching. It's still a conflict. Russia has put 2,000 troops in between two opposing forces that are known for shooting each other despite ceasefires. This is not where you would want to send your troops. The potential for a Russian peacekeeper to be killed is high. And if they're killed, determining how and why, or was it deliberate or accidental, could prove almost impossible. They're likely to be hurt by Soviet-era munitions, a Kalashnikov rifle, bullets manufactured in the Soviet Union. You're not going to easily point to one if someone is killed and say, oh my goodness, here's who shot them. No, it's not going to be a simple task at all. And will there be those kind of violations? I would be astonished if there weren't. It's been the practice in this region for decades. So would Russia want to go there? If it saw an alternative, I don't think so. And if you look at the agreement that was reached in Moscow, it very clearly has a 5-year term in it. It's renewed if the parties want to renew it. If not, Russia leaves. I don't think Russia wants to be there this way. Does that affect Russia being in the region? Russia's military arrangement with Armenia is totally separate. That may go on for decades. I don't know. That depends on where Russian and Armenian interests are. But they didn't need to be there in this way.
So I think there are many others who are very concerned about the Russian presence. And as you said, the Russians were in Armenia, but they were never in Azerbaijan as troops, boots on the ground, as you say. And there's a great deal of concern out there, and many disagree with you about the Russian strategy and motivation for being there. And Russia has done this in the past. Has gone in as a peacekeeper, but in the events and what has proceeded or followed that was Russia sort of taking control, handing out passports. I think there is a real concern in the community.
No, I'm not saying people don't have concerns. I think they do. I also know is the reality of the world. If you went in for one reason, that can change. I believe Russia did not want to do this. It has done this. Will that lead to a change in strategy or foreign policy aims? It could. But I also still see from all indications Russia is very willing and wants to engage in a continued discussion via the Minsk group. I don't think that process would survive if the aim of Russia is really a different one with a different purpose in this region. So no, I think right now that remains an open question. Did Russia already had been providing armaments to Azerbaijan in a significant way? No, it did not have troops on the ground. I don't think it felt a need or desire for that. It now faces a different situation in the South Caucasus with the presence of Turkish forces in Azerbaijan. I think that's something it also did not want to see, but that's a new part of this reality too. I think what it highlights is how important it was to try to find a peaceful settlement of the conflict and the vital necessity to try to continue that again.
Well, I think that those out there are concerned of the pattern of Russia, for example, in Moldova for 30 years, and that was supposed to be a limited time as well. So I think there are many in the diplomatic community that are keeping a close eye on the Russians.
Sure. And Moldova, that is a very different circumstance too, and I used to work on that conflict as well. And I do think these things can develop a different life and turn out in a different way. And I think we saw that most vividly in Georgia. And I think in a way no one wanted to see. The way it's come out is not good for Georgia. It's not good for Russia.
Well, and the question about Georgia is recent inklings that Georgia could be invited into the EU as well as NATO. And some of the recent happenings that have occurred in Georgia might be putting a halt, if not, slowing down that process of democracy, which is.
No. And I think the reality of the war that took place between Armenia and Azerbaijan caused equally problems in Georgia. The political instability in Armenia today certainly doesn't help political stability in Georgia, or for that matter, probably in Azerbaijan. This is why the world engages in trying to prevent conflict, and when conflict arises, try to resolve conflict. None of this is good for democracy. Certainly, it's not good for prosperity. There's a fragility to modern economies that, when conflict breaks out, can be very frightening. I was in Lebanon just right before the outbreak of COVID, that year before, visiting areas where we're working with Syrian refugees. And the situation in Syria not much earlier was totally different than the situation today. And the ability to rebuild Syria, the ability to rebuild Lebanon after conflict. We see this all around the world. You and I were speaking earlier of Africa, and we see this in Africa too. You can have a very significant economic growth and progress, and that progress can be wiped away with conflict. War is a horrible thing, and I think it's incumbent on us as an international community at all levels, state to state, international institutions, NGOs, to work where we can and how we can to advance peace.
Before I let you go, I just want to touch base with you, get your take on something that just happened. I heard that there will be U.S. sanctions against individuals in Russia concerning the Alexei Navalny situation. What's going to happen there?
I've not seen those reports. Sadly, I've been busy with other things today. It doesn't surprise me. I think that would call for another long discussion to that question, Justice. So why don't I leave it there? But it's been a pleasure talking with you today.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Carey Cavanaugh, and also a very noted peacemaker throughout the world. Thank you for your time, and I promise I will come back and ask you more about some of the situations that are happening in the South Caucasus in the region.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thanks.